Battle of the Aisne, where the Western Front froze in place. September 13th, 1914. The dawn mist rises over the Aisne River, curling around the low hills and chalk cliffs of northern France. The air smells of smoke, mud, and cordite. On both banks, the exhausted armies of France, Britain, and Germany are locked in a deadly race to secure the ridges overlooking the water. The fields below are still wet with dew and blood from the Battle of the Marne, fought barely a week earlier. The Germans, retreating north, have dug in on the high ground, the Chemin des Dames, while the Allies push forward, believing that one final attack might end the war before winter. What neither side realizes is that this battlefield, stretching from Soissons to Reims, will mark the end of movement and the beginning of a new kind of war. The Aisne River valley is narrow and steep, its banks cut by centuries of erosion. Small villages cling to the slopes, their roofs shattered by shell fire. To the south, pontoon bridges creak under the weight of British and French troops, crossing in columns, rifles slung, uniforms still streaked with the dust of the Marne. Among them are men of the British Expeditionary Force, survivors of Mons and Le Cateau, grim veterans in khaki who have marched and fought almost without pause for 3 weeks. "We thought the Germans were finished," one private later recalled, "but when we reached the river, the hills ahead were alive with their guns." General Joseph Joffre, still riding the wave of the Marne victory, believes the German retreat can be turned into a rout. He orders an immediate pursuit. The British commander, Field Marshal Sir John French, agrees reluctantly. His men are exhausted, his artillery nearly out of shells, but the chance to break the enemy line seems irresistible. Across the river, however, the Germans have already stopped running. General Karl von Bülow and General Alexander von Kluck, their armies battered but intact, have chosen their ground carefully. The limestone ridges north of the Aisne provide natural defensive strength, commanding views, solid cover, and deep soil for entrenchment. It is here that the German army begins to dig. By the morning of September 13th, the Allies attempt their crossings. British engineers work feverishly under sniper fire, throwing temporary bridges across the Aisne's slick current. In the village of Venizelle, the 1st Division crosses first, advancing into the fog toward the heights beyond. The Germans wait until the first wave reaches open ground, then unleash a storm of fire. Machine guns rattle from hidden pits. Artillery on the ridges rains shells on the riverbanks. The fields erupt in fountains of mud and flame. "It was like walking into a storm made of iron," one British sergeant wrote. Whole platoons vanish within minutes. Despite the losses, the Allies press on. French troops storm the slopes west of Soissons, fighting hand-to-hand through vineyards and chalk quarries. The British gain footholds north of the river, but find themselves pinned by unseen guns. Every advance invites counterfire. The Germans, now masters of the defensive art, use pre-sighted artillery to devastating effect. Their shells, fused to explode just above the ground, shower the attackers with deadly shrapnel. By nightfall, the riverbanks are carpeted with the dead. The Aisne, once clear, runs brown with silt and blood. For the next 3 days, the battle intensifies. The Allied commanders order repeated assaults on the German ridge positions, convinced that a breakthrough is still possible. But each attack meets the same fate, progress measured in yards, not miles. On the night of September 15th, torrential rain turns the slopes into quagmires. Trenches collapse, rifles clog with mud, and wounded men drown where they fall. Horses sink to their chests in the chalky soil. Soldiers dig shallow pits with their helmets, seeking any protection from the shell fire that never seems to stop. It is here, amid the rain and ruin, that the shape of modern warfare begins to form. Units that were meant to attack begin to dig, first for shelter, then for defense. Across the valley, German engineers do the same, linking foxholes into continuous lines. Within days, both sides are entrenched. Between them lies a strip of shattered earth, the first version of what the world will soon call no man's land. By September 18th, the scale of the stalemate becomes clear. Allied shells fall short. German counterattacks fail, and neither side can move forward without catastrophic losses. The BEF's guns, designed for open battle, cannot dislodge an enemy buried in earthworks. Attempts to outflank the German line only extend the fighting westward toward the Oise and the Somme. The race to the sea has begun, a desperate series of overlapping maneuvers as both armies try to reach the channel first. Reports from the front grow grim. "The enemy is invisible," one French lieutenant writes. "We fight the ground itself." The landscape transforms into a lattice of trenches, craters, and wire. Villages vanish beneath bombardment. The farmers who once worked these fields flee or die where they lived, and still, the generals issue orders for attack, as if movement might be conjured by will alone. On September 20th, Joffre finally halts major offensives. The Battle of the Aisne has lasted barely a week, but its consequences will echo for years. What was meant to be a pursuit has become a siege. Soldiers now fight from holes instead of hills, and every yard of France becomes a fortress. The realization dawns slowly, almost reluctantly, among the high command. The war will not be over by Christmas. Behind the lines, supply wagons churn through mud to deliver food and ammunition. Medics work in barns converted to hospitals, amputating limbs by lantern light. The wounded arrive faster than they can be treated. For the first time, men begin to understand the permanence of their situation. "We are digging into the earth," a British corporal writes home, "and the earth is swallowing us whole." The Aisne River flows quietly through it all, indifferent, marking the place where the world's armies stopped moving and began to die in place. By late September 1914, both armies had settled into positions that neither could abandon. The German First and Second Armies had entrenched themselves along the heights of the Chemin des Dames Ridge, their trenches dug deep into chalk and reinforced with timber. They overlooked the entire Aisne Valley, giving them commanding fields of fire. The Allies, spread along the southern slopes and flatlands near the river, had little choice but to dig in opposite them. The pursuit that began after the Marne had solidified into an impasse, a confrontation of artillery, shovels, and endurance. The men at the front adapted to the new reality almost instinctively. Units rotated between attack and defense, each discovering that survival depended less on bravery than on engineering. British and French infantrymen spent their days carving firing steps into the muddy walls of their trenches, building dugouts from corrugated iron and sandbags filled with chalk dust. German soldiers, aided by superior organization and tools, built elaborate fortifications, 2 and sometimes 3 lines deep, connected by communication trenches. Theirs were drier, better drained, and more permanent. They even installed wooden floors and firing parapets. It was the first sign that this was no temporary position, but the beginning of a siege that would consume Europe. Artillery duels now replaced movement. The sound of gunfire rolled across the valley without pause, echoing between the ridges. Allied observers, perched in church towers or tethered balloons, tried to spot enemy batteries through the haze of smoke. But the Germans had learned to camouflage their guns beneath netting and straw. Every time the Allies fired, counter-barrages answered within minutes, guided by precise spotting from aircraft. The front lines became landscapes of smoke, flame, and ruin. On September 25th, German reinforcements under General von Zwail launched a series of counterattacks against the British positions near Missy and Vailly. The assaults were fierce, supported by heavy howitzers firing from concealed emplacements. At first, the British held their ground, but the constant shelling forced them to fall back into improvised secondary trenches. The pattern of the Western Front was being set, a brutal rhythm of advance, bombardment, and retreat, where victory meant little more than holding one's own trench by nightfall. In Soissons, French troops clung to the southern bank, launching repeated attempts to storm the high ground across the river. Each time the result was the same: courageous charges cut down by machine gun fire. "The river is no longer water," wrote one French officer, "but mud and corpses." The realization spread from regiment to regiment that the war of maneuver had died. In its place stood a war of endurance, measured in inches and days, rather than miles and weeks. Behind the front, supply and logistics became as vital as tactics. Mule trains carried shells to the batteries, field kitchens boiled thin soups over open fires, and stretcher-bearers trudged through the mud to bring back the wounded. Rain turned the chalky soil into glue. Boots rotted, rifles jammed, and trench walls collapsed under their own weight. Yet every man understood that these miserable ditches were now their home. The generals on both sides still believed the stalemate might break. In October, Joffre ordered flanking maneuvers northward toward Arras, hoping to roll up the German line. The Germans responded in kind, extending their trenches westward to counter. Each move led only to more entrenchment, more lines, more death. The conflict stretched toward the sea, a crawling, endless contest, later called the Race to the Sea, though there was no running, only digging. By November, the front extended from Switzerland to the Channel coast. Meanwhile, morale at the Aisne remained grim, but defiant. Letters from soldiers spoke less of fear and more of disbelief. "We are no longer soldiers," one British private wrote, "but miners with rifles." Daily life became a strange mixture of terror and routine. Dawn, stand to, sentry duty, ration distribution, the ceaseless scraping of shovels, the sudden blast of incoming shells. At night, men listened to the enemy across no man's land, voices carrying over the quiet between bombardments. Sometimes, when the wind was right, they could hear German songs echoing from the opposite ridge. Among officers, the lesson was clear. Modern firepower had outpaced movement. The machine gun, barbed wire, and high explosive shell had combined to make defense overwhelmingly superior. Neither bravery nor numbers could overcome prepared positions without catastrophic loss. The Aisne proved this beyond doubt. Future offensives at Ypres, Loos, Verdun, and the Somme would all follow its grim pattern. Casualty reports from the battle shocked both governments. The Allies lost more than 13,000 men in a matter of days. The Germans, perhaps 10,000. Yet the line barely moved. Newspapers back home printed the word stalemate for the first time, though few yet grasped what it meant. Joffre, ever confident in his bulletins, called the battle a strategic consolidation, while Berlin proclaimed that the German line had repelled all assaults. In truth, both sides had achieved nothing but exhaustion. When October rains turned the Aisne Valley into a swamp, the fighting slowed to scattered artillery exchanges and sniper fire. Winter approached. Soldiers scavenged doors, beams, and even church pews from ruined villages to reinforce their shelters. Fires were banned at night to avoid detection, so men huddled together for warmth. Frostbite and pneumonia claimed as many lives as bullets. The front was now a living graveyard, silent at dawn, deafening by noon, and quiet again under the moonlight. By December 1914, the pattern was fixed. Every advance met with counterattack, every victory buried in mud. Across Europe, the commanders planned new offensives, still clinging to the illusion that momentum could be restored. But those who had fought at the Aisne knew better. They had seen the war change before their eyes, from fields of maneuver to corridors of death. When spring came again, the river still flowed quietly between the same ridges. The trenches on either side deepened and multiplied, stretching farther each month, until the land itself seemed scarred beyond recognition. The Battle of the Aisne had ended, but its shadow would last until the final shots of the Great War. By the beginning of October 1914, the Aisne had ceased to be a battle and become a condition, a state of permanent confrontation stretching across the valleys of northern France. Both armies now occupied parallel worlds, separated by a few hundred yards of devastation. Between them lay the corpse-strewn ribbon of no man's land, an open graveyard filled with splintered trees, collapsed farmhouses, and the rusting remains of field guns. Any movement across that zone invited instant death. The age of open warfare, of cavalry charges and rapid marches, had ended for good. General Joffre still clung to the belief that victory could be achieved through persistence. "If we cannot go through," he told his staff, "we will go around." He shifted divisions northward toward Arras and Lille, hoping to outflank the Germans before they could dig in completely. But the enemy mirrored every move. Von Kluck's First Army, reinforced and disciplined, dug trenches with mathematical precision, extending their line yard by yard to meet the Allied advance. What began at the Aisne slowly expanded into a wall of earth and wire, stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The Western Front was being born, not by design, but by exhaustion. For the men who occupied the trenches, the experience was both new and ancient. A return to siege warfare in a modern age. The sound of picks and shovels filled the nights as soldiers labored under flickering lanterns, carving homes out of the earth. Dugouts were reinforced with timber beams stolen from barns. Sandbags were piled shoulder high. When it rained, water filled the trenches to the ankles, then to the knees. When it froze, the mud hardened into ruts that tore boots and feet alike. "We have stopped marching," a French corporal wrote home, "but the war marches on above our heads." Supplies arrived irregularly, often delayed by the destruction of bridges and roads. Horses, once the pride of every army, began to die by the thousands from exhaustion or lack of fodder. They were buried hastily behind the lines, their carcasses rising like mounds across the fields. Soldiers grew accustomed to the smell of decay. They smoked to drown it out. Rats multiplied by the millions, feeding on the unburied dead. In letters home, soldiers joked darkly that the rats were the real victors of the Aisne. Tactically, the generals tried to adapt. Artillery observers began coordinating more precisely with frontline troops using telephones and signal flags. The British experimented with aerial reconnaissance, sending fragile biplanes over the German lines to photograph trench systems. These grainy images, showing intricate webs of fortifications, shocked Allied commanders. The enemy had transformed the landscape into a fortress, with lines so deep and well built that frontal assault seemed impossible. And yet, no other method existed. By late October, the weather worsened. Continuous rain turned trenches into rivers of muck. Rifles rusted, bayonets dulled. Soldiers built parapets from sandbags mixed with broken bricks. They slept in mud, their greatcoats soaked, their boots never dry. Frostbite and trench foot became common. Medical officers issued orders for men to rub whale oil on their feet. But supplies were scarce. "The ground eats us," one private wrote, "and the sky never looks down." Despite the misery, a strange rhythm of life emerged. At dawn and dusk, the most dangerous times for attack, both sides would stand to arms, rifles ready, watching for movement. When the expected attack didn't come, they relaxed, cleaned weapons, and cooked what rations they could. Tea on the British side, thin stew or coffee on the French, ersatz bread and sausage on the German. Between bombardments, an uneasy quiet would settle, broken only by the drip of water and the occasional crack of a sniper's shot. By mid-October, engineers were already mapping permanent trench systems, complete with dugouts, command posts, and communication lines. What had started as improvised defenses was hardening into a continent-wide structure, one that neither side yet realized would define the next 4 years of war. The Battle of the Aisne had become the prototype for everything to come. Deep trenches, interlocking machine gun positions, barbed wire entanglements, and the grim understanding that offense no longer held the advantage. News from the front filtered home slowly. Governments censored reports to maintain morale. The British public still believed the army was pushing north. French newspapers spoke of temporary entrenchment. German bulletins boasted of holding the heights against overwhelming force. None admitted that the armies were stuck, that the war had frozen in place before autumn had even ended. Only the soldiers knew. In one sector near the village of Soupir, British and German trenches lay scarcely 60 yards apart. The men could hear each other talking, coughing, even singing. At night, flares lit the sky like artificial moons, casting shadows across the wreckage of the valley. Between the lines lay the bodies of comrades, too exposed to retrieve. They would remain there through the winter, unburied, marking the invisible frontier of a new kind of warfare. It was during these bleak weeks that the Allies first began to grasp the scale of what had happened. Staff officers noted that every attack cost thousands of lives for a few hundred yards. Supplies of shells could not keep pace with the rate of fire. Cavalry units, once the decisive arm of war, now served as messengers or scouts, their horses too vulnerable to survive modern firepower. Air reconnaissance, telegraphs, and railways had changed the tempo of war entirely. The Aisne had not only frozen the front, it had frozen time itself. General French, writing in his diary, confessed what few dared to say aloud. "We have reached a wall, and no man knows how to go beyond it." His French counterpart, Joffre, was less poetic but equally resigned. "The enemy is entrenched. So are we. The line is stable." That stability, however, was an illusion built on suffering. By November, snow began to fall. The white drift softened the battlefield, covering shell holes and corpses alike. Men on both sides decorated their trenches with scraps of canvas to block the wind. Fires burned secretly at night, hidden from enemy observers. Somewhere across the valley, a German bugler played a slow, mournful tune, and the British answered with silence. The Battle of the Aisne had begun as the continuation of the Marne and ended as the foundation of the Western Front. Its outcome was not victory or defeat, but endurance. The grim realization that the war would now be fought not across countries, but across trenches. By the winter of 1914-1915, the Aisne front had hardened into permanence. The soldiers who had once believed they were passing through France on their way to Berlin now spent their days carving deeper into the earth. The smell of damp soil, decay, and wood smoke became the scent of the Western Front. Each army developed its own system of survival. The Germans dug their trenches in steps, each line higher and stronger than the one before. Their bunkers were reinforced with logs and concrete, some so deep that artillery shells barely disturbed them. The British and French, less equipped and still clinging to the hope of mobility, built theirs quickly and shallowly, improvising with whatever they could find, doors, beams, and sandbags filled with broken chalk. The line along the Aisne became a laboratory for the modern war. Spotter aircraft from both sides circled above daily, sketching maps and photographing trench systems. Wireless radios, still primitive, crackled with coded messages. German gunners learned to use sound ranging and flash spotting to locate Allied batteries, adjusting their fire within minutes. In response, Allied engineers built dummy gun positions and camouflage screens of netting and grass. Even the smallest skirmish now felt scientific, measured by mathematics and maps instead of courage. Each day followed the same rhythm. At dawn, both sides stood to arms in expectation of attack. Snipers took their shots in the pale light, each searching for a brief silhouette on the opposite parapet. When the sun rose, the artillery began. Slow, methodical, and relentless. Shells screamed across the sky and exploded along the chalk ridges. Sometimes the bombardment lasted an hour, sometimes all day. Then, in the sudden silence that followed, stretcher-bearers crept out to collect the wounded, dragging them through the mud. Letters from the front revealed the growing disillusionment. "This is not war," a French infantryman wrote to his wife. "It is farming. Only we grow graves instead of wheat." British officers, writing home, struggled to hide their despair from their families. "We are learning," one major wrote, "that there is no going forward, only staying alive." For the generals, the Aisne was a puzzle without solution. Joffre and Sir John French met repeatedly to discuss renewed offensives. Each proposed attack required millions of shells, weeks of preparation, and resulted in the same grim equation: enormous losses, negligible gains. Both sides now recognized that the war had entered a phase of industrial endurance. Victory would not come from maneuver, but from attrition, the grinding down of men and resources until one side simply ran out. Behind the lines, the machinery of war expanded. New railways were laid to bring supplies to the trenches. Mobile field kitchens served thin stews of barley and canned meat. Ammunition depots and hospitals sprang up in the ruins of villages. Civilians who had not fled now lived in cellars, emerging only at night to gather water or bread. Children carried messages for soldiers. Churches became dressing stations. In Soissons, the cathedral's great stained glass windows lay shattered, but the bells still tolled for the dead each evening. Throughout the winter, small attacks flared along the line. German storming parties raided at night, throwing grenades into trenches and vanishing before dawn. British and French troops retaliated with bayonet charges that won little more than empty craters. Neither side advanced more than a few hundred yards, yet every attack cost hundreds of lives. The phrase wastage rate entered the vocabulary of staff officers, a clinical term for daily deaths. The Western Front had become a machine that consumed men faster than any army could replace them. In January 1915, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the Aisne Valley. The front fell quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. The frozen ground brought temporary relief from mud, but added new dangers: frostbite, collapsed trenches, and the eerie silence that magnified every sound. In some sectors, informal truces occurred. Soldiers shouted greetings across the lines or exchanged tins of food by throwing them over the wire. These fragile moments of humanity were swiftly suppressed by officers who feared they might erode discipline. The war had to continue, even if no one remembered why. By spring, both sides began to experiment with new tactics. Sappers tunneled beneath enemy trenches, packing explosives to detonate under fortified positions. Observation balloons rose again, tethered to cables that stretched into the clouds. Every innovation seemed to deepen, not shorten, the stalemate. When the weather warmed, the smell of the front returned, a mix of corpses, cordite, and unwashed bodies that clung to everything. The Battle of the Aisne had officially ended months earlier, but its legacy remained written in mud and steel. It was here that the war transformed from motion to stagnation, from attack to endurance. The line that began along the Aisne became the spine of the entire Western Front, a continuous scar dividing Europe. The soldiers who had first dug those trenches could not have known that they were shaping the war's defining landscape, nor that they themselves would never escape it. When reinforcements arrived from Britain in the spring of 1915, the newcomers stared in disbelief at the maze of ditches, parapets, and wire. "We thought we had come to relieve them," one recruit said, "but it was we who entered their grave." The Battle of the Aisne had achieved nothing measurable in territory or triumph, yet its meaning was immense. It marked the moment when modern warfare revealed its true face. From that river onward, every soldier who fought on the Western Front would live and die in its shadow. The Aisne was more than a battle. It was a revelation. The moment the modern world understood that progress could dig its own grave. On those misty ridges of northern France, armies armed with the inventions of an industrial age discovered that innovation and annihilation had become inseparable. The Aisne did not end in victory or defeat. It ended in realization that no army, no courage, no number of guns could move a line once the earth itself had become the enemy. The soldiers who fought there were the first generation to live inside the war rather than march through it. They built their lives between parapets, measuring time not in days, but in bombardments. The noise of the guns replaced the rhythm of speech. The ground beneath their feet became both home and tomb. When they wrote home, their words were stripped of ambition. They no longer spoke of victory, only of survival. The dream of a swift, decisive war had drowned in the trenches along the Aisne. For the generals, the lesson came slowly. They had inherited doctrines built for movement, for cavalry and open fields. But the world had changed. The Aisne showed that courage could no longer conquer technology, and that leadership, no matter how noble, could not command the laws of modern firepower. The future of warfare, static, industrial, and total, was born in those chalk cliffs and muddy slopes. And yet, in the midst of that futility, there was still endurance. The soldiers kept digging, kept fighting, kept writing home. They learned to laugh in the darkness, to share cigarettes in the rain, to build a sense of humanity in a place designed to erase it. In that endurance lay the only victory the Aisne would ever offer, the triumph of the human spirit over the machinery that sought to bury it. When the war finally ended 4 years later, the trenches along the Aisne remained exactly where they had begun, filled with rainwater and ghosts. Grass grew over the parapets, erasing the lines men had died to defend. The river still flowed between its white cliffs, quiet, unbothered, as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath that calm surface, the world had changed forever. The Battle of the Aisne was not the bloodiest, nor the most famous, but it was the most decisive in silence, the point where history stopped moving forward and began digging downward. It was here that the Western Front froze in place, and the modern age learned how stillness could kill.